Welcome back to Horror Vault. In this video, I will tell you 4 spooky and terrifying yet true horror stories related to Costco store employees happened in different parts of the world. I would recommend to subscribe to Horror Vault if you have not done it yet, so that you will get the first notification of our latest true story video. Without delay, let's get to the first true horror story. Story 1. The Woman in White. It was a quiet Tuesday night when my shift at Costco began. The store, which was usually bustling with families and shoppers during the day, transformed into a cavernous, eerie expanse after hours. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of my sneakers against the polished floor. My job was simple: organize shelves, complete inventory checks, and ensure no customers were left behind after closing. That night, it was just me, Ramon, the security guard, and a new guy from cleaning whose name I hadn't yet learned. Ramon was stationed in the security booth near the entrance, watching over the cameras with his usual stoic demeanor. The cleaner was somewhere in the back, scrubbing down restrooms. I decided to start my inventory round in electronics. The glow of televisions displaying promotional videos cast flickering shadows across the aisles. It was oddly comforting, almost normal. But as I moved toward the section of laptops and tablets, I heard it for the first time, a faint murmur. I froze. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it sounded like someone whispering just out of earshot. "Ramon?" I called out hesitantly, my voice echoing through the empty store. No response. I shook my head and laughed nervously at myself. It had to be my imagination, or maybe one of those weird noises that big buildings make when they settle. Shrugging it off, I continued with my work. But as I turned into the next aisle, something caught my eye, a figure at the far end of the corridor. It was just a glimpse, a flash of white disappearing around the corner, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer. I quickened my pace and rounded the corner where I thought I'd seen her. The aisle was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned every shadowy nook and cranny for signs of movement. Nothing. "Maybe it's just Ramon playing a prank," I muttered under my breath. Trying to shake off the unease creeping over me, I moved on to the food section. The shelves were lined with neatly stacked cans and boxes, their uniformity somehow unsettling under the dim lighting. As I counted items and jotted notes on my clipboard, that sound returned, the faint murmur, but this time it was closer. I spun around quickly, scanning for its source. My flashlight beam danced across rows of cereal boxes and jars of peanut butter, but found nothing out of place. And then there she was. A woman stood at the far end of the aisle, partially obscured by towering stacks of soda cans. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her long black hair hanging limply over her shoulders. Her face was turned away from me, as if she was staring at something on one of the shelves. "Ma'am?" I called out cautiously, stepping toward her. "The store is closed." She didn't move or respond. "Excuse me," I said louder this time as I approached her slowly. But as soon as I got within 10 feet of her, she turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes, they weren't normal eyes. They were dark, too dark, like twin voids that seemed to swallow all light around them. Her expression was blank, yet unnervingly intense, as though she was staring straight through me rather than at me. "Are you okay?" My voice cracked as fear took hold of me. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a small, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then she vanished. One moment she was there, the next, she wasn't. I stumbled backward in shock, nearly dropping my clipboard. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Had exhaustion finally caught up with me? I bolted toward Ramon's security booth without looking back. When I reached him, he glanced up from his monitors with mild curiosity. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked. I think there's someone in here," I stammered. Ramon frowned and turned his attention back to his screens. "No one's here but us," he said firmly after scanning through several camera feeds. "But I saw her." My voice rose in pitch as panic set in. A woman, long black hair, white blouse. She was right there. Ramon sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "You've been working too hard," he said dismissively. "These late shifts mess with your head." Frustrated but unwilling to argue further, I returned to my rounds, though every creak and shadow now set my nerves on edge. Hours passed without incident until it was nearly time to wrap up for the night. As I made one final sweep through the aisles, something compelled me to check near the refrigerated section where we kept frozen goods. That's when I saw her again, this time reflected in one of the glass doors housing frozen pizzas and ice cream tubs. She stood directly behind me. I spun around instinctively, but once again nothing. My heart thundered in my chest as cold sweat dripped down my temples. Desperate for answers, or perhaps just reassurance, I decided to confront Ramon again before leaving for good that night. When I described what had happened this time around, the reflection, the way she seemed to appear and disappear at will, Ramon's expression grew serious for once. "You're not crazy," he admitted quietly after a long pause. "Others have seen her too." "What do you mean?" My voice barely rose above a whisper now. "There's a story," Ramon began hesitantly, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone or something might overhear us even now. "A few months ago, there was an accident outside in our parking lot late at night. A woman got hit by a car while crossing through one of our lanes." He paused again before continuing grimly. "They say she never really left." The rest of that night passed in uneasy silence, as Ramon's words echoed endlessly inside my head. She never really left. Though nothing else happened before dawn broke over Costco's sprawling lot outside. Something told me this wouldn't be last time anyone encountered her wandering these aisles late into another sleepless night ahead. Story 2. The closing shift at Costco. I don't know what I was thinking when I agreed to take the closing shift at Costco. It had only been 3 months since I started working there, and while the job was mundane, something about the place always felt off. Maybe it was the sheer size of the warehouse, with its towering shelves and endless aisles. Or maybe it was the constant hum of fluorescent lights that made time feel like it didn't exist. Whatever it was, I ignored it because I needed the money. That night, I clocked in at 7 p.m. The store was still bustling with customers, carts overflowing with bulk items they probably didn't need. By 8 p.m., things had quieted down. The automatic doors still hissed open and shut occasionally, but most of the noise had faded. The work of a cashier at Costco is repetitive, scan, bag, repeat, but that night, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and every so often, the lights flickered faintly above me. At 8:30 p.m., when the store was nearly empty except for a few stragglers hunting for last-minute deals, a man approached my register. He was tall and gaunt, his greasy hair clinging to his forehead and a scraggly beard framing his pale face. He pushed a cart with only one item in it, a large box of detergent. I thought it was odd for someone to come in so late for just one thing, but I didn't dwell on it. "Good evening," I said as I scanned the box and told him the total. "May I see your membership card?" The man didn't respond. He just stared at me with an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. His teeth were yellowed and crooked, and his gaze felt like it pierced right through me. "Sir?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your Costco membership card?" He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull out his card or maybe some cash, but instead, he pulled out nothing. His hand remained clenched in a fist, as if holding something invisible. Then he smiled wider. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something about him wasn't right. "I need your card to complete the purchase," I said again, my voice faltering slightly. The man didn't say a word. He simply turned around and walked away, leaving the cart and the box of detergent behind. I stared after him as he disappeared into one of the darkened aisles near the back of the store. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked down at the box on my counter. It seemed ordinary enough, just a standard box of detergent, but something about it made me uneasy. Shaking off my nerves, I finished closing out my register for the night and began counting the cash in my drawer. As part of our routine, we were required to check security footage before locking up for the night. Out of curiosity and maybe a little paranoia, I decided to review the footage of the strange man. What I saw made my blood run cold. On the screen, there he was, walking toward my register, but his cart was empty. There was no box of detergent in it at all. I rewound the footage several times, convinced there had to be some kind of glitch or mistake. But every time I watched it, it was the same. An empty cart being pushed by a man who looked like he didn't belong there. I turned back toward my counter, where the box still sat untouched. Slowly, hesitantly, I opened it. It was empty. My hands were trembling as I closed the box and placed it back on the shelf where it belonged. It's just a prank, I told myself under my breath. Some weirdo messing around. But deep down, I didn't believe that. As I tried to shake off my unease, Javier, the janitor, walked by with his mop and bucket. He'd been working at this Costco for years and always seemed unfazed by anything. "Hey, Javier," I called out nervously. "Have you ever noticed anything strange around here?" He stopped mopping and looked at me with a tired smile. "Strange? You mean like ghosts?" He chuckled softly, but then grew serious when he saw my expression. "Why, did something happen?" he asked. I hesitated before explaining what had just occurred. The man with no card, the empty footage, and the hollow detergent box. Javier listened intently before nodding slowly. "You're not crazy," he said finally. "A lot of weird things happen here after hours." "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned on his mop handle and glanced around as if making sure no one else could hear us. "This place, it's not normal," he said quietly. "Sometimes merchandise moves on its own, like someone's rearranging things when no one's looking. And don't even get me started on what people have seen in certain parts of the store." "Like what?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. Javier hesitated before answering. "The electronics section," he said finally. "People say they've seen figures standing in front of TVs, but their reflections don't show up on screen." A chill ran down my spine as he spoke. "Most of us just ignore it," Javier continued with a shrug. "It's easier that way." Before I could ask him anything else, our manager called over from across the store, asking me to tidy up the furniture section before leaving for the night. Reluctantly, I made my way over to that part of the store where patio chairs and sofas were displayed in neat rows under dim lighting. The air felt heavier here, as if something unseen lingered just out of sight. As I straightened price tags and adjusted cushions, I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from somewhere nearby. I froze in place and listened closely. The sound grew louder, a dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across concrete floors. But when I turned around to look, there was nothing there. My pulse quickened as I tried to convince myself it was just Javier moving equipment or another employee finishing their tasks. But deep down, I knew better. Then out of nowhere, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing between two shelves at the far end of the aisle staring directly at me. Or at least that's what it felt like, because its face wasn't visible beneath its dark hooded form. I blinked, and it was gone. The scraping noise returned louder this time, as if whatever had been watching me moments ago was now moving closer and closer and closer. I dropped everything and bolted toward the exit, without looking back until I reached Javier, waiting by his cleaning cart near our cars outside under flickering parking lot lights. "You okay?" he asked concernedly when he saw how pale my face must have looked by then. "Yeah," I lied breathlessly, while fumbling for my keys, trying not to think about whether or not that shadowy figure might still be lurking somewhere inside those endless aisles waiting for someone else foolish enough to work late shifts alone. From that night onward, I never volunteered for closing shifts again, And every time someone mentions Costco, I can't help but wonder what other secrets lie hidden within those towering shelves under those flickering lights. Story 3. The Forgotten Below. It started as an ordinary night shift at Costco. My name is Luis, and I had been working there for about 6 months. The night shifts were monotonous but peaceful, perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. That night, it was just me and my coworker Jorge, along with the security guard Miguel. We were tasked with reorganizing inventory and cleaning up the store after closing. The vast aisles of Costco always felt different at night, eerily quiet, with only the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of metal shelves breaking the silence. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the polished floors. I usually kept my headphones in to drown out the unsettling stillness, but that night, something compelled me to keep them off. Jorge and I had been assigned to reorganize the furniture section. It was tucked away in a corner of the store, far from the main entrance and surrounded by towering shelves of box lamps and chairs. As we worked, Jorge suddenly stopped and pointed toward the wall behind one of the shelves. "Hey, Luis," he said, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Have you ever noticed that door before?" I turned to where he was pointing. There it was, a small wooden door, partially hidden behind a stack of box lamps. The paint was peeling, and the metal doorknob was rusted. I frowned. I had worked in this section countless times before, but had never seen that door. "Maybe it's just a storage closet," I suggested, though something about it felt wrong. Jorge grinned mischievously. Only one way to find out. Before I could stop him, he pushed aside the boxes blocking the door and turned the knob. To my surprise and unease, the door creaked open easily, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Whoa," Jorge said, peering down with his phone flashlight. "This is definitely not a storage closet." "Maybe we should tell Miguel," I said uneasily. The air wafting up from the staircase was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. "Come on," Jorge said with a laugh. "A quick look won't hurt." Reluctantly, I followed him down the stairs. The steps were steep and narrow, made of old concrete that crumbled slightly under our weight. The further we descended, the colder it became. The faint smell of damp earth grew stronger, mingling with something else, something acrid and sour. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long corridor lined with metal doors. Each door had a number etched into its surface. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10. The walls were made of rough stone, slick with moisture and covered in patches of moss. "What is this place?" I whispered. Jorge shrugged but looked just as unsettled as I felt. Maybe an old storage area? Or something they built when they constructed the store. I shone my flashlight on one of the doors. It was slightly ajar. "Let's check it out," Jorge said before I could protest. He pushed open the door with a loud creak that echoed down the corridor. Inside was a small room containing several metal beds lined up against the walls. On each bed lay skeletal remains, human remains, dressed in tattered clothing that looked decades old. I stumbled backward in shock, nearly dropping my flashlight. What is this?" Jorge stammered, his face pale. The room smelled of decay despite how old everything appeared to be. The skeletons were eerily arranged as if they had simply lain down and died there together. Some still clutched objects, a rusted locket, a broken watch, that hinted at lives long forgotten. And then we heard it, a whisper. It started faintly, almost imperceptible over our ragged breathing. But it grew louder, an indistinct murmur coming from somewhere deeper within the corridor. "Did you hear that?" Jorge asked nervously. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The whispers grew clearer as we stepped back into the corridor. They weren't random noises. They were words. "Don't forget us. Don't leave us." My heart pounded as we turned toward another door at the end of the hall. The source of the sound, unlike the others, This door was closed tightly and bore no number or markings. "We need to leave," I said urgently, grabbing Jorge's arm. But he shook me off. "What if someone's trapped down here?" he argued. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed him to the door. It took both of us to force it open. It groaned in protest before finally giving way. Inside was another room, larger than the first, but similarly filled with metal beds arranged in neat rows. These beds were empty except for thick leather straps attached to their frames, as if meant to restrain someone or something. The whispers stopped abruptly as we stepped inside, and then we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing through the corridor outside. Jorge and I froze in place, staring at each other in terror. "Who's there?" Jorge called out shakily. No response, just more footsteps growing closer. I grabbed his arm again. "We need to go now." This time he didn't argue. We bolted out of the room and back toward the staircase. But as we reached it, we saw her, a woman standing at the top of the stairs. She wore a white dress stained with dirt and blood. Her long black hair hung limply over her face, obscuring her features except for her eyes, dark pits that seemed to absorb all light around them. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, but her voice echoed unnaturally as if coming from all directions at once. We froze in terror as she began descending toward us one slow step at a time. Jorge snapped out of his trance first. "Run!" he shouted, and we did. We sprinted back down the corridor without any sense of direction or plan. Just blind panic, driving us forward until we stumbled into another room filled with shelves stacked high with dusty files and papers. Frantically searching for an escape route, while trying not to hyperventilate from fear or exhaustion, we found another staircase hidden behind one of those shelves leading upward again, but this time into what seemed like an abandoned part above ground level, connecting back, eventually upstairs unnoticed, where everything seemed normal again upstairs. To this day, I never returned there again. Story 4. The delivery to the abandoned house. It was a cold November afternoon, one of those days when the sky hangs low and gray, making everything around you feel heavier. I remember it vividly because it was the day my job as a delivery driver became something I'd never forget. Up until then, my work was routine, loading up the truck with Costco orders and delivering them to various addresses around town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. That day, however, something changed. I had been assigned several deliveries for the day, most of them standard, bulk groceries, cleaning supplies, and oversized items that only Costco could sell. Among them was an order for a house in a quiet neighborhood on the southern outskirts of town. The name on the order was Ramirez, a common enough surname that didn't raise any red flags. It was supposed to be my last stop of the day, and I was looking forward to finishing early. The GPS guided me through increasingly desolate streets as I approached the address. The neighborhood felt off. The houses were large but neglected, their lawns overgrown, and windows darkened by heavy curtains. It was eerily quiet. No kids playing outside, no cars passing by, not even a dog barking in the distance. As I turned onto the final street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I arrived at the house, it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The two-story structure loomed over me with its peeling paint and rusted iron gate. The yard was unkempt, with weeds growing wild and covering most of the pathway to the front door. I double-checked the address on my delivery sheet against what was displayed on my GPS. It matched perfectly. I parked my truck and stepped out into the chilly air, grabbing the first box from the back. The gate wasn't locked. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, sending an echo down the empty street. As I approached the front door with my arms full of boxes, I noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through trees, just silence. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing happened. After a few minutes, I knocked louder this time, hoping someone would hear me. Just as I was about to give up and call customer service to report an undeliverable package, the door creaked open. A woman stood there in a tattered gray robe that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her hair was long and disheveled, hanging limply around her pale face. She stared at me with wide eyes that seemed both confused and terrified. "Mrs. Ramirez?" I asked hesitantly. She nodded slowly but didn't say anything. "I have your Costco delivery," I continued, trying to sound professional despite my growing unease. "It's a few large boxes. Should I bring them inside for you?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she stepped aside wordlessly, gesturing for me to enter. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been for late November, and carried a damp, musty smell that made me want to gag. The house was nearly empty except for a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. There were no decorations on the walls or any signs of life. No family photos or personal belongings. Just bare rooms that felt abandoned. I placed the boxes down near what looked like it used to be a living room and turned back toward her. "Anything else you need help with?" I asked politely. She shook her head quickly and muttered something under her breath that I couldn't make out. I nodded and made my way back toward the door when suddenly I heard it. A voice, a deep male voice, coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. "What did he say?" I asked instinctively before realizing how strange my question sounded. The woman froze in place, as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face turned pale, paler than it already was, and she began shaking her head violently. "No one's here," she whispered hoarsely. "You need to leave." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond or even process what she had said, something moved upstairs. A shadow darting across one of the windows on the second floor. "Who else is here?" My voice trembled despite my best efforts to sound calm. She didn't answer me this time. Instead, she slammed the front door shut behind me as if trying to trap whatever or whoever was inside away from us. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally snapping out of it and rushing back to my truck. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get my keys into the ignition. As soon as I started driving away from that cursed house, my GPS began malfunctioning. The screen flickered erratically before going completely blank. Panicked but determined not to stop anywhere near that place again, I relied on memory to navigate through what now felt like an endless maze of identical streets lined with decaying houses. Eventually, and mercifully, I found myself back on familiar roads leading toward downtown, where everything seemed normal again. People walking their dogs, cars honking at intersections, life going on as usual. But just when I thought it was over, that whatever had happened at that house would stay behind, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. One of those boxes from earlier sitting neatly in my truck bed despite having delivered all of the moments ago at Mrs. Ramirez's doorstep. And then came another realization. The box wasn't just any box. It was the box. The one containing detergent. Only this time its lid wasn't closed tightly anymore. It had been opened slightly, as if someone or something had been inside all along. And that's the end of these Costco true horror stories. Let us know your opinion about these stories in the comment box, and don't forget to subscribe to Horror Vault in order to listen to our true horror stories. I will meet you in our next video.